Society in Rio. And I'm very pleased and honored to welcome you at the first meeting of the Dynamic Coalition on Platform Responsibility. What we want to emphasize at the start is that we coined this concept of platform responsibility, trying to focus on something more than the legal requirements that legal systems have with regard to online platforms and their behavior. We want to focus on the social role that this platform have, and in particular, the expectation that people have that these platforms are adopting procedures that comply with human rights. As you know, human rights, as contained in treaties, apply to states. There are no specific hard law provisions applying human rights to corporations, but we had 3 years ago some principles issued at the UN level on business and human rights that create a framework on the basis of which states have the responsibility to protect human rights, corporations have the responsibility to respect human rights, and they both have a joint duty to provide an effective remedy. So by focusing on the aspect of responsibility, we want to move away the discussion beyond intermediate liability, even if we recognize that the two concepts are necessarily related. Just to mention two ways in which they are related, often in the reform discussions that are taking place regarding notice and takedown procedure, arguments are being made that there is a need to include due diligence requirement for companies in order to benefit from immunity or to escape liability. And on the other hand, there is a problem that if you don't have specific rules on intermediate liability, or you don't have specific requirements to respect fundamental rights, companies through their terms of service can enjoy a wide discretion and not necessarily bring to bear that responsibility to respect human rights that the UN guiding principles put forward. So because of the importance of terms of service today, and given that essentially it is what companies do, they are based in a country, usually if we are talking about internet companies, they will be based in the US, and they do a wholesale exportation around the world of the policy that they apply in their own jurisdiction. It is particularly important to ensure that those terms of service contain the minimum safeguards that allow us to have continuous responsibility to protect and respect human rights, respected in all jurisdictions. So basically, now we are going to hear two different perspectives from two different organizations about what initiatives are there now, and to what extent we can differentiate ourselves from these initiatives. I think also my co-founder Luca wants to make some remarks about the importance of dynamic coalition in this space and the extent to which we can bring this debate forward in an innovative way.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. My name is Luca Belli, I work at the Council of Europe. I'm one of the co-founders of this dynamic coalition on platform responsibility. So before our two keynotes, just a couple of introductory remarks. We know that platforms have a responsibility to protect and promote human rights, being corporations, according to the UN principle, they have a responsibility to promote human rights. However, we know that at the end of the day, the spectrum of rights and remedies that a platform user enjoy is defined by the terms of service, which are an essential tool to regulate cloud-based global services that are provided through transnational cyberspaces. But these terms of service are frequently difficult to comprehend or even to read entirely, can vary from one cloud provider to another, can be unilaterally modified by the cloud provider, and can provide some remedies for some specific violations, such as copyright or some kind of online harassment, but those remedies are not standardized and are frequently put in place, and decisions are taken without a transparent framework by private entities. So our goal, our initial idea here was to elaborate model a contractual provision that could be put into terms of service that can standardize mechanism to seek redress and to have to promote the full enjoyment, a concrete full enjoyment of platform users' rights. And we want to build this coalition also on the experience of another dynamic coalition, the Dynamic Coalition on Net Neutrality, that last year elaborated a model framework on net neutrality and showed that an interaction, a cooperation among stakeholders could go beyond simple dialogue and can achieve concrete outcomes. Now, those outcomes can be efficient or not efficient, could be improved, not improved, but concrete outcomes are achievable. We want to discuss today with you how to achieve those outcomes together, and to have an understanding on what could the dialogue, in which direction the dialogue can evolve. We have two keynotes. The first is from Jan Kleijsen, who is Director of Information and Society and Action Against Crime at the Council of Europe, and the second will be by Rebecca Keenan, Director of the Ranking Digital Rights project at the New America Foundation. So, Jan, please.
Thank you very much, Luca. Good afternoon, everyone. A few words about the role of the Council of Europe in this dynamic coalition, which we very much encourage and welcome. The Council of Europe, as most of you will know, is an intergovernmental organization. It brings together 47 governments, representing some 800 million people. And it is perhaps best known for the European Convention on Human Rights. And to many of you, notably its Article 10 on freedom of expression, I think will ring a bell. We also have other conventions in the fields that are being discussed at the IGF, such as the Cybercrime Convention, the Data Protection Convention. And as the word indicates, these conventions are all interstate treaties. What we have done, however, since our very early days, which go back to 1949, when the organization was founded, is to involve civil society in the elaboration of our legal standards. And that is a tradition and has been carried out and has been going on already for many years. What is relatively new is to address companies, to deal with business as a partner. We have started to include a direct reference to business in our 2007 Lanzarote Convention against sexual exploitation of children, where there is a direct call on the finance industry and travel industry to cooperate in the fight against sexual exploitation of children. Give an example on the travel industry that passengers who travel to countries where child prostitution is common are warned by the airline through a leaflet in the cabin that they should refrain from doing certain things, and that if they notice certain behavior, that there are telephone numbers where they can alert this to in order to help protect children also outside Europe's borders. Now, we have also applied this principle of not only, because we also on this convention, I can assure you, civil society, children's rights organizations were of course very heavily consulted, but we've also started to introduce this multi-stakeholder approach in our standard setting as regards the internet. The first time was in 2008, when a soft law instrument, as we call it, the recommendation, guidelines in this case, were adopted as regards internet service providers and the games industry. And that was a text which was drawn up by governmental experts together with representatives from industry. We had then in 2013, in fact, in the week before Mr. Snowden came out, a declaration by the Committee of Ministers regarding surveillance technologies and the risks relating to that, which stressed the issues of privacy by design and privacy by default measures, both by states and, very importantly, also non-state actors. And then this year, and we had a side event yesterday, or a workshop, regarding the new recommendation on a guide to human rights for internet users, and I recognize several of you who were there yesterday as well, which is a compilation of existing rights within the Council of Europe area, found in the European Convention on Human Rights as interpreted by the court, so it takes account of the latest case law, and it's also directly in its recommendation not only asks states to bear these rights, to guarantee these rights, as of course states are under the obligation to provide human rights to their citizens, but also calls upon the private actors to do so, and that's of course what we will be discussing here today. It is clear that because of the globalization of the internet, the global nature, I should say rather, of the internet, no single government and also no regional organization can alone ensure full respect for human rights on the internet. And as Sir Tim Berners-Lee said, it's not naive to think that human rights should be ensured, but that is not naive, but it is naive to think that this will happen automatically. So we need partners, governments and governmental organizations need partners, and of course platform providers are one of the first categories of partners that come to mind. We very much hope that the guide that was discussed yesterday will be taken up by platforms. We also hope we will get support from leading companies to raise awareness of this guide of internet users, because it's addressed really to the user. Right? It is not written for lawyers, it's written for the average user. It says you have the right to do this, you are entitled to this and that the platforms will help us. What we also hope platforms will do is that they will examine their own terms and conditions. And my usual question to any audience is, how many of you have actually read Google's or Facebook's terms and conditions before using their services? Is there anyone who's actually read it before using the services? Perhaps some of them. Is there anyone who's read it at all? Right, you're... This is a particular audience. This is the largest number of yes. I've never, ever had more than one hand raised.
I guess the question is, how many people read it for their personal enjoyment?
Yes, it is absolutely. Absolutely. But it shows, I think, that there is that the guide that there is a need for users to be informed in a more clear and concise way of what their rights are, and we very much hope that platforms will do so. I think there's also an interest because at a recent conference I attended in Rome, I had the occasion to say so yesterday, so I apologize for repeating myself. But the University of Malta has carried out some interesting research, and it put the question whether you went to a number of it was a survey, the percentage of respondents that trusted governments with their data was, or that did not trust, I should say, did not trust governments was more than 50%. What was interesting in the study was that more than 70% didn't trust companies to protect their rights. So I think there is really, I think, something to reflect upon also by the platforms, especially I think the companies that do take corporate social responsibility seriously, how they can enhance also the trust, because that's what we're talking about, the trust of their users, that they do take this seriously. So without further ado, we look very much forward to your suggestions and any proposals that you may make on how we can assist you in ensuring that human rights, as Sir Tim Berners-Lee said, are in fact really respected on the internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. We're going to move over to Rebecca.
Thanks. Very glad that you took the initiative to create this dynamic coalition. A couple years ago, I published a book in which I referred to global internet companies as the sovereigns of cyberspace because their private rules, their code, their design choices have such an impact on what people can and cannot do on the internet, what you can see, how you interact with society, with other people. And a number of the companies complained to me, we're not sovereigns, we can't put people in jail, we can't torture people, we don't have militaries, we can't tax you, and plus we're subject to all these government demands ourselves, and you're not being fair. But nonetheless, I think there is a form, and I think one reason why we're here is there is a form of private sovereignty. Obviously, it interacts with state sovereignty, and I'm very glad that both of you referenced the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which recognizes that, yes, businesses do have human rights responsibilities, that governments have the duty to protect human rights, but businesses also have an obligation to respect human rights, and that obviously this is a complex dynamic with a great deal of interplay. And one of the initiatives that I think relates to the work of this coalition, but which I think this coalition can really help supplement, because that initiative has not dealt so much with private rules, is the Global Network Initiative, which launched in 2008 with a set of principles on freedom of expression and privacy for companies to commit to, and a set of implementation guidelines. But this really dealt almost completely, or really deals almost completely, with government demands. So given that companies are operating in regulatory contexts where in an ideal world, all regulations and law would be fully compatible with international human rights norms, we do not live in such a world. And so given that companies are faced with demands all around the world that compel them, in the view of at least some, to do things that are not compatible with human rights, how should companies deal with this? How can companies minimize human rights harm and maximize the freedom of expression and privacy of their users in relation to government demands? And so the GNI developed a set of guidelines that some companies have agreed to follow and submit to an assessment process to actually demonstrate the extent to which they are actually trying to put these guidelines into place. But the GNI is not dealing with terms of service, with the private rules that companies set up, or consumer privacy particularly, except where that interacts very directly with government demands. It's really an initiative that's dealing almost completely with that intersection between the company's operation and what the state sovereignty is demanding of the companies, affecting user rights. And so we've seen also, I think, in the past several years with some of the other dynamic coalitions, I think a great deal of consensus evolving around, what internet users' rights should be. But we don't have much stakeholder consensus or sort of clear conversations happening yet about what should the private governance of internet platforms look like if it's going to be human rights compatible. And the UN Guiding Principles that you referenced earlier, there are sort of three basic things within the protect, respect, and remedy framework that the Guiding Principles recommends for companies. The first is that a company must make a policy commitment to meet their responsibility to respect human rights. So to what extent are internet platforms today making a public policy commitment? In fact, we're only seeing that happening with a few companies very recently, and sometimes it's in kind of very bizarre ways, like we're the free speech wing of the free speech party. Is that a commitment to human rights, or what is that? You know, so you can guess which company I'm talking about there. But you know, exactly how is the commitment articulated? Is it articulated in any kind of human rights framing, or is it articulated just in their own kind of, you know, their own corporate culture framing? And to what extent is it important that that commitment be articulated in a way that maps to human rights language and human rights standards? And so that's one question. Also, the Business and Human Rights Framework recommends that companies develop a human rights due diligence process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impact on human rights. And that shouldn't just be in relation to government demands. There should be a due diligence process taking place both in the drafting of terms of service and in the formulation of how terms of service is enforced, and a continuous due diligence around that enforcement process and what are some of the human rights issues that are arising, that are being raised by stakeholders. This requires stakeholder engagement in order to carry out this due diligence process in any kind of meaningful way. So what does that look like in relation to private enforcement in terms of service? We're not sure. We have a much clearer sense of what that would look like in terms of government demands, because the G&I companies at least have been building that due diligence process. But for private enforcement, it's very unclear. There's not been a lot of discussion. And then third, among the recommendations from the UN framework is that companies should initiate processes to enable the remediation of any adverse human rights impacts that they cause, to which they contribute in some way. And so this was talked about a little bit in the morning's workshop as well. You know, what are the complaints mechanisms? What are the remediation processes that you know, what efforts are companies making, not only in terms of complaining against abusive behavior by other users, but if your content is taken down and you feel that, you know, unjustly or in a way that violates your right to freedom of expression, is there any way to appeal, and how much due process? I constantly hear complaints from stakeholders about lack of due process in how problems are appealed. And basically my own personal observation has been that activists around the world who get their social media accounts deactivated or certain content taken down, and it seems like it was a mistake or a misunderstanding by the platform, if they happen to be lucky enough to know me or to know somebody at EFF or, you know, somebody in one of these organizations who has contacts at the companies, then they can sort of find some way to have it looked at a second time and get it fixed. But if they don't kind of know the right people, then they're just plain out of luck. And so what are some of the mechanisms to help improve that? I think that's another question to be looked at, because talking to the companies, I haven't heard a lot of good ideas for how to improve that problem solving that goes on beyond very ad hoc kind of personal networks. So that's I think there's a lot of work that this dynamic coalition can do that really hasn't been done by other organizations. While at the same time, there's certainly a lot of organizations that are working on and have been working on different aspects of these problems. So CDT is here. CDT has done work on account deactivation and you know, content removal for terms of service enforcement, and has published some documents on best practice in that regard. I'm not going to use this as a platform for promotion of my own project, but Alan Barr and I are working on ranking digital rights, where we're working to create kind of benchmark standards for ranking companies on free expression and privacy criteria. And this includes not just how they handle government demands, but also also how they're handling their private enforcement, and what would those standards look like, and how can we kind of measure companies. And so that's one other project to contribute to this effort, but I don't think duplicates at all. And I know we've got APC in the room with the women's principles, and some important work on how to deal with gender-based violence and threats in a way that is mindful of freedom of expression concerns, but also how to get companies to engage with stakeholders on these issues in a manner that makes the platform something that men and women and people of different persuasions can all use safely. And that's a big challenge ahead. So it seems that there are a lot of gaps that this dynamic coalition can potentially help to fill. I don't see a whole lot of companies here. That's one of, oh, yeah, one here. Okay, yeah, so we do have a few. But definitely finding ways to bring have, I think, a fairly practical discussion on what's the way to move forward. There was some, and I'll stop talking in a moment, but there was some discussion in the workshop this morning about how stakeholder engagement can work in a more effective way. And there's a question about, are there some models of, should companies be having sort of stakeholder councils? Is there some way for kind of user representatives to be brought into discussion to reflect different perspectives and concerns from different groups, different stakeholder groups that can help the companies with their due diligence around terms of service, around how things are enforced, around how their complaints mechanisms are structured, how remedy is pursued. There could be some, I think, interesting models or mechanisms from other multi-stakeholder processes that perhaps companies might be able to adopt elements of. Or perhaps not, perhaps something new needs to be invented. But that's, again, I think, an interesting set of questions to explore here. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very complete picture of the framework, not only from the Council of Europe side, but also looking into what are the initiatives that are taking place in the field. We would like very much here also to hear what you are doing, in what way you see important the concept of platform responsibility, and in what way your organization or institution is contributed to that end. Also, we want to understand in this first meeting what are the main challenges that are to be analyzed if we want to promote responsible terms of service. What are the main issues that we should tackle in this exercise? So I can start just by mentioning one. I think today one of the big problems that increasingly will be exposed to us is the rise of automated enforcement. So there will be algorithms essentially making decisions over us that have substantial impact on our rights. And one of the big challenges I see is how and to what extent we can incorporate safeguards in this algorithm so as to respect our human rights. I think this can be done by including those safeguards in the terms of service, so that at least if the algorithm doesn't respect the terms of service, we can hold the companies to the standard they set in there. So, but this is just to start off the discussion. We wanted to hear essentially what you see as the main challenges and what you propose as an organization to do to tackle them. So with this, I open the floor.
Do we have a roaming mic to pass, or otherwise, no? So, well, if we can open the floor and we can start with some remarks. Jan, you wanted to add something, or we can?
No, since there are several companies here and the question was asked, it would be very interesting to I think now give them the floor and to see what is being done by various companies on the issues that we've just mentioned.
Does any volunteer want to start with some practical suggestions?
Well, I'm not a company. I'm not representing a company. Sorry, John Carr from the European NGO Alliance for Child Safety Online, and I apologise for arriving at this conversation later than perhaps many other people in the room, so I'm not up to speed with all of the things that have been discussed in some of the earlier meetings that you referred to in your opening remarks, but perhaps just a rather obvious point, you know, children and young people, that's to say legal minors, are people too, and they have human rights too, and I just wondered whether or to what extent that dimension had been incorporated, Rebecca, in the considerations that you were referring to, or that others had taken into account when considering this question. And you know, these rights go in both directions. There's rights to be protected, but there's also rights of access. It's not all one-way traffic, but it is a distinct and particular dimension, and it's got legal dimensions to it. They're referred to expressly in the Lanzarote Convention, but of course classically they're in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But that is a particular bit of this debate that obviously I wouldn't want to be overlooked.
Maybe we can take a couple of other suggestions. I think Rika had a question or a suggestion.
Thank you, Luca. So my name is Rika Jørgensen. I'm from the Danish Human Rights Institute. So we are a national human rights commission. We do monitoring nationally, and we also have research where I'm located. And then we've done actually work on human rights in business for many years, but only recently in relation to the ICT sector. First of all, I think the creation of this coalition is very timely. And also, if you noticed, I've noticed that the program here at IGF, there are really a lot of workshops addressing this topic from various angles. And I mean, I've been working on it from different angles for a long time, but I think one of the points that Rebecca made was really spot on in terms of what is the sore issue at this particular point in time, where you have, you have the ROCKY guidelines that a lot of companies are referring to, and it seems that a lot of internet companies in particular are framing their activities and their corporate discourse in terms of human rights compliance. But it's very much, like you said, in relation to states. It's very much in relation to potential state actions that violate international human rights standards, and the discussion is not near as advanced when it concerns corporate policies or practices that are not related to a state intruder, but simply related to business interest in terms of using user data, exchanging user data, terms of service. Could also be for various other moral or ethical courses they have taken on. So I think that's really very core, and it's taken me a while to figure out that when I was talking, for instance, with participants from the Global Network Initiative, and they have all these nice norms and guidelines, and they talk about human rights compliance and on freedom of expression and access to information, and then at the same time you can point to a lot of concrete practices, term of service maybe being the most well-known of them, that are clearly not in line with international freedom of expression standards, that are driven by other agendas, and really getting that up on the table and being able to address that in an open and frank, forward-looking way. I think it's very important and spot on for where we are now, also because we have now the ROCKY framework that we didn't have a few years back.
Excellent comment. I think there was another comment from the lady there.
I think, sorry, I have a cough. Just to emphasize the point that has been made already, but just another thing I think we need to focus on is the issue of transparency. What kind of information is available? Do we know how decisions are made? Who makes those decisions? What kind of training do people get? I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is to really think about users as differentiated, because often even when reporting processes and mechanisms are clear, they make an assumption around the ability of people to respond, whether it is in terms of language or whether it is even in terms of whether people have access, because often people who don't have access to the internet experience particular kinds of violations through the internet. So we also need to think about that differentiation.
Excellent points. Do we have some immediate reaction from our keynote speaker, or do we want to open the floor for reactions from maybe some other stakeholders? Rebecca.
Sure, just briefly, just to address your remark, John Carr. I mean, there's always this kind of tension between the free expression kind of advocacy and the child protection. But this is where I think stakeholder engagement, and I mean, all stakeholders concerned with all different aspects of human rights, the full spectrum of human rights, in formulating terms of service, in formulating enforcement practices is so important, and where actually that type of stakeholder dialogue around very specific problems and questions of a particular platform, trying to get it right, is perhaps an opportunity to bring together different stakeholder groups that are sometimes at odds with one another around solving a particular difficult question of how do we protect the rights of children without treating adults like children, and over enforcing or providing excuses, and all of those difficult questions. But yeah, it's tough and definitely shouldn't be ignored.
I think the gentleman there had a remark.
Thank you. My name is Per Strömbäck. I'm the editor of Netopia. We're a Brussels-based web magazine and think tank. And first of all, let me echo that I also appreciate that this topic is being discussed at the IGF. My previous background is in the games industry, and I would like to share an experience from working with child protection in the games industry. There is a system in place which some of you may be familiar with called PEGI, the PEGI age rating system. That's a pan-European game information system. There are some mechanisms there that I can think would be a good inspiration for this process. So first of all, there is a control at the point of sales or point of delivery. You have to buy the box game at the retailer, and the retailer will see if the person buying it is underage. So there's a mechanism for control there. The system itself has an oversight committee, the PEGI Advisory Board, which is sort of the annual meeting to which the board and the operators are responsible. So that's part of the conversation that I've heard these couple of days about accountability. If you have some sort of membership or annual meeting, etc., that fixes a lot of the accountability issues. That's built into the PEGI system. And also there is government oversight. There is a charter with, or a contract with the European Commission, so that every couple of years the PEGI administrators have to go to see the commissioner and answer questions about how they do to improve the knowledge about the PEGI system in the general public, etc. So there are three mechanisms. And bear in mind that this is an entertainment product. It has nothing to do with trafficking, child abuse, personal photos being distributed, or big data tracking of personal information. It's only controversial content, problematic content. So, in fact, the challenge is less severe than what we're talking about for internet services. But the control system is so much more developed. So I think these three mechanisms could be a good inspiration for this conversation going forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Also, I would like to highlight that the goal is also, it is to gather suggestions, but the goal should be to develop model contractual provisions that define this mechanism and that can be implemented, inserted directly in the terms of service. And what was also said this morning, I said it, sorry, this comment, sorry for repeating myself, but what is essential, what is key to restore trust in online services is that the users can have a connection, a visual connection with the provision. So, for instance, little labels or badges like the Creative Commons badges allow the user to understand that a certain mechanism is within the terms of service without having to read 4 or 5 or 6 pages of description without understanding what is written inside the description. So what is essential is to elaborate model contractual provision and to link them to specific visual labels that can allow the user to understand their existence and restore trust into the service that use them. So do you have any other remarks maybe on this specific topic or on your personal experience in your companies, in your usual activities that regard platforms' responsibility?
We have a comment there. I just wanted to perhaps first interject and make a clarification. This is an important clarification that the final aim will be to produce model contractual clauses. However, this, of course, will take some time. We cannot focus on all human rights within the next few months. So hopefully we will continue this conversation on a regular basis with the mailing list to which everyone is invited to subscribe. But I think one of the key challenges and the key objectives of this day is to identify what particular rights we want to focus on, what particular issues, precisely because we want to have a practical focus as opposed to just enunciating principles, which is something that maybe the Dynamic Coalition on Rights and Principles has already done. So with that, I give you the comment.
Sure. Hi, my name is Emma Alonso. I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology, and just wanted to offer a little bit of more information about the report that Rebecca mentioned that CDT and the Berkman Center had done several years ago, where we were taking a look at, after there were several very high-profile incidences of major social networks taking down activists' profiles or deleting their content because of reasons that weren't really very clear, or they were reasons that you could find in the terms of service but that had not seemed to be enforced consistently across the board on the platform. And so what we really ended up finding as an important first step to protecting individuals' free expression rights as they use these platforms is exactly this point of clarity and consistency and comprehensibility of terms of service, and making sure that what the platform is deciding is and isn't allowed on the platform is clearly articulated in a way that users can understand, because many of them are not employed in the profession of reading terms of service like so many of us in this room. And also the consistency in responding to when there's a suspected violation of terms of use, so that you don't have an ad hoc response where some people's request or flags of content are responded to and others aren't, and it becomes unclear really how bound by the terms of service the platform considers themselves to be. But also, incredibly important, the opportunity for redress and for appeal that's been discussed. And along with that, that as one of the ways to avoid abuse of these kinds of systems, because another key concern is that whatever gets articulated in the terms of use as allowed or disallowed content will then be used by others to silence, which I'm sure is not a new concept for anyone in this room. But those were just some of the things that we had identified as really crucial issues when looking at how to implement the terms of service that the platforms develop.
It seems like the ability to appeal, have an effective remedy, is definitely one, if not the most important issue in this space. Is there any other?
Yes. Gabriel, and then
gentleman there.
Yes, thank you, Gabrielle, Article 19. Just briefly to comment on how to draft the model terms and conditions. Our experience...
Could you speak closer to the mic? Sorry.
We work a lot on conflict of rights, so conflict between freedom of expression and the right to privacy, hate speech or hate speech online. And so what we find is a lot of the time there is a lack of clarity. So of course, great to get either standards or provisions that are as clear as possible. But the problem is that ultimately you always end up with a conflict of rights. And a lot of the time you're in a gray area, so you might fall on one side of the line. So you may still end up with someone who disagrees with a decision that's been made on the basis of those terms and conditions. I think one of the things that could be useful is to refer to the international standards, and when the complaints are examined, look at the various standards that have been developed in international jurisprudence. So for example, in relation to the conflict between freedom of expression and privacy, there's fairly well-developed case law, for example, at the European Court of Human Rights on the sort of criteria that can be used. And I think it would give greater legitimacy to these appeals processes if they relied on these fairly well-established criteria. You could even imagine a sort of screen and, just make sure that the person who's looking at compliance is looking at these different factors to try and get to a fairer decision. Thank you.
Oh, is the microphone somewhere?
I think
not. Doesn't look like.
maybe it's better to use that mic. So Sasha and then Carmen.
Hi, I'm Sasha van Geffen. I'm with Greenhost, and I'd like to push the discussion a bit back to the platforms themselves. I think effective remedy is the major point we have to solve, but it's also a very hard point to get across towards companies. So I think we have to come up with something that sounds to them or to us as a solution and not as another problem. I think in other fields, like for instance insurance, sometimes companies have actually teamed up to have some kind of appeal board that functions for multiple organizations. I think that could be an interesting thing to explore, if we can have some kind of appeal mechanism that that is actually outsourced in that sense, that it is not a company's problem. Then we need to have appropriate feedback loops, especially because a lot of the down actions are automated, are algorithms. Those algorithms will have bugs. If you look at the context, what they're trying to achieve and what they achieve in real life, we need to see how we can actually make sure that engineers will keep improving those algorithms and etc. So I think we really need to look at as a dynamic coalition how we can come up with tangible solutions that actually make the life of those platforms easier and at the same time solve the problems we find are very urgent to solve.
Excellent. I think Carmen has it.
I have more like a comment. I think it's a very timely thing also to have this, because I just read the paper, I think last week, where the research suggests that in order to read all the privacy terms you use during 1 year, it would take 76 working days. So in that meaning, none of us actually have 76 working days to just keep yourself up to date of how your internet companies could violate your privacy rights. So I think it would be a great challenge and however great outcome if in the end there would be something like Creative Commons labels for example privacy. So an internet company can actually choose, like for privacy I will take the red label, that has this criteria, then you have different set of labels for how do you handle the complaints. Do you have notice and takedown? Do you have notice to notice? What kind of system do you use? Do you use automated systems? So you would have to just have, you can't, I don't think you can actually start out very, very largely as a whole terms of services. However, if you just start by firstly privacy, because you can actually see that you have alternatives for every single problem that you can see in privacy. You have either this or you have this. Where do you store data? How do you encrypt it? What do you do with it? So I think it would be very, very cute also for internet users to open a page and then you just see on the downside that, okay, it has a blue privacy and green notice and takedown. So that would be great.
Yes, just wanted to mention about that there is already something similar. It's called Terms of Service Didn't Read, but that is, as I understand it, has a broader focus because it's a consumer protection-oriented mechanism, and so instead we want to focus on human rights. So we will have a more concrete focus on what the mechanisms to ensure the protection of human rights are. There was another question here by Nick.
But it is an excellent suggestion.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on both of those comments, and you'll have to excuse me, I want to try something that I don't normally do and come leaping to the defense of platforms. Because I don't think we actually want due process, not in any way that we understand that term. When we're looking at terms of service, they're always drafted to have maximum discretion, to enable the platforms to control what happens on their network. And that is something, if we take the sovereignty metaphor a little bit further, that is fundamentally incompatible with the due process values. So I can call them rule of law values, which are fundamentally a restraint on the arbitrary exercise of power. So I think the problem is, in a large part of the problem is, we don't actually know what we want. And by that I mean, there are significant costs to due process. There are barriers to entry to the market, and there are costs on innovation, as well as static costs. And without understanding the costs that we're talking about imposing on intermediaries, on platforms, I think that it becomes very difficult to talk about the abstract principles that we want, because in the end it's going to need to be detailed and very highly context specific in order to understand how we might like to see this space, because a legitimate space that has no innovation or has no services is also not really a space that we want to create.
Gentleman, and then David.
Hi, David Ferris with 21st Century Fox, and sorry for those of you who were at the morning session, but I think it's important to reiterate the point that I made there, and I recognize the point that was made that oftentimes there is a balancing act that needs to be done up between or among different human rights, and there is some significant jurisprudence around that. But at the same time, as I mentioned this morning, there are some clear-cut cases where sites are dedicated to illegal activity, and we need to be clear that it's, laws that create illegal activity that are consistent with democratic principles. We're not talking about political censorship or things like that. But for example, the pirate sites that I mentioned that are also facilitating the dissemination of child pornography, which John has mentioned in the past, and it's those same sites that also host ads for prostitution and malware. There should be easy solutions to those, and there's responsibility among the entire ecosystem to work together to address that type of clear illegal activity. And I don't know how it fits in the terms of service activity that you are working on in this dynamic coalition, but there's got to be some way it can be brought in. And I'm talking about our own interests, but then there is also the fake pharmaceutical sites and a whole host of sites that are dangerous to individuals.
Thanks.
I can't refrain from abusing the position. I think this, just to clarify, this, for example, clear cases of obviously illegal website, it would be probably something that falls into intermediary liability if you don't if you don't act to protect the rights of people who are being harmed in those cases. So it wouldn't fall under the terms of service framework that we're trying to design here.
There could be links to those sites that are dedicated to illegal activity in platforms, et cetera. So how that would seem to me to fall in some way into the terms of service of those platforms.
Sure.
Isn't that a law enforcement issue? Or is it a private enforcement issue?
I think the entire ecosystem probably needs to work together, because law enforcement isn't going to have the resources to do all of this.
But this goes to the point that there are cases where the conflicts are not that problematic. It's more clear. I think what we can do here is, indeed, on the basis of the human rights jurisprudence, identify what those clear-cut cases are. But in the case of blatantly illegal activity, I think there is not even the need to worry in the terms of service, because that would be covered by standard liability rules. But maybe others have other ideas.
Also, I mean, we have already a quite ambitious objective. Let's not be over ambitious and try to solve any kind of cybercrime problem with terms of service. And so, David, please.
I want to go back to the point about using Creative Commons style icons or something that's easy. The truth is, if you look on terms of service that you didn't know, or whatever the website is, I read the terms of service. In many cases, I don't know that the platforms want all their users to really know the extent to which their flexible language has been written. So putting up a logo that says, we can take you down at our discretion and we can do this and that, is probably not in their best interest. And this is going to have to be a voluntary implementation, more than likely, so that's going to be a tough ask. What we might ask is a higher level ask, which is, in your terms of service and your general operating procedures, maybe you can use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a framework to be good corporate citizens, and try to push it in that respect. So if you are a search engine and you're linking to illegal pharmaceutical websites, even if by the letter of the law what you're doing is not illegal, although in the case of Google it cost them $500 million in the United States, there's a next level down, which is, are you doing the right thing? And I think that some corporations will step up and say, yes, we want to be good corporate citizens, and we've tried to design our terms of service around, and that might be a way to try to lure some corporations into this voluntary process. I don't know.
I think, Marco and then Paolo.
A word on the exercise that is very useful and interesting, and I'm here more to listen than to give an input, because again, I really would like to see how we can solve this problem, because again, I'm sure that getting into the weed, we can come with the icons. Yes, we can get with, we can have icons, we can have shorter terms and conditions, we have clear wording, but I'm sure that there would be challenges in any case. I mean, I can tell you that we have normal lawyers, we have normal people at Google. We try to solve the problem, to simplify the way we express our terms and conditions. Probably we don't do a great job, but I can tell you that whenever solution we are coming with is raising controversy. So actually we have more to learn from this process than to give input. This is why I'm here. On the comment on the rest, for sure, on the blatantly illegal content, I agree with Nicola that the solution is there, and what we can do in terms of responsibility for rogue pharmacies or for taking voluntary measure. Again, that's another clear area where probably we should take a step back and let the people fight, because as you can imagine, it's in our interest to make sure that the user on our platform have the best experience. We try to do our best in order to make this happen, closing account, collaborating with authorities, making sure that on AdWords there is no way for this criminal organization to exploit their activities. But at the same time, the question about the kind of balance that we need to take between becoming the police of the web and not doing anything is out there. And so again, on this probably we need to listen more and to understand ideas and things that we can do to improve, but the solution is not easy to find.
Just a question, given that you are speaking, the conflict of rights was mentioned. Google will have a huge challenge to deal with, which is the implementation of the right to be forgotten. Will this end up in the terms of service? Do you know if there is anything that the Dynamic Coalition could do, for example, to facilitate human rights compliant implementation of this?
Sure. I mean, ideas are absolutely welcome. If we can find together a wording that can be used in order to make effective the implementation of the right to be forgotten, and oh my God, that's going to be terrific. I mean, we are not the one coming with. We are not the one here saying that we have all the answers. Actually, in the last months, we showed that we want to do our best to comply with, for example, with the decision from the court, but we want also to listen from other parties if what we are doing is in line with their expectation, if there are better ideas, if there are, that's why we have the advisory committee in place, this is why we are having public hearing, this is why we are listening to everyone, and feedback are actually very welcome on this.
Thank you. Was there another question? Yes.
Oops. So, I don't really want to derail the conversation, but this is the second time I've heard about prostitution and sex work and all of these things being thrown about as very unproblematic areas of legality or illegality or criminality, and then being used as a way to kind of strong arm, to kind of persuade much more stronger arm responses to some issues of content regulation and takedown. I would like to say that these things are actually quite complicated. They are sites of struggle. In fact, sex work itself is not that simple. Solicitation may be legal, but actual action of sex work may be illegal. And what is sex work? What is prostitution? All of these things are still being contested. Stuff like abortion as well. For example, Google AdWords does not allow abortion in some countries where actually abortion is legal. So these are contested areas. I don't want to get into that conversation, but I just want to say that it's complicated. So my actual point to add into this conversation is that maybe I actually really quite like the idea of trying to push for service providers or social media companies at least to have some kind of how do you put it? It's just like a principle, like we adhere to principles of human rights, and that's just your basic standpoint. Like before we do anything else, this is the principles in which we really try to respect and adhere to, and then here are the different mechanisms in which we are trying to deal with some of these things. And maybe there's some peer ranking that can happen between different social networks, like to what extent we are doing the job as better, to what extent are we doing the job that we set out to do according to these principles that we're trying to address. And I really like Rebecca's idea of getting all of these different, the multiplicity of human rights sectors to be part of the conversation as well, and that human rights isn't just like one monolithic thing as well.
So I think Paolo and then the lady there.
Paolo Lanteri from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and I need to ask some more down-to-earth question, just to get a better understanding of what we are really discussing here. The first thing is really, what is the scope? It's an extremely ambitious project and laudable one, but are we talking about all human rights? Are we talking about some human rights? Are we talking about other rights, like copyright? Or not, I mean, related to human rights as well? Like, what is the scope, the first question? And the second one, really on the process. The Dynamic Coalition has the objective of drafting recommended terms of uses. How is going to happen practically? Who is going to do the first draft? How the multi-stakeholder approach is going to work in practice, and how you make sure all players are contacted and welcome to contribute. And maybe this is not the purpose. And finally, I have a specific question, like, would this draft contractual provision include or provide for something like a dispute resolution when there is a case of, for instance, one human rights case, violation case, for instance, of privacy? Would that include the dispute resolution mechanism? Do you foresee something like that? And if you foresee something like that, how do you budget in the concept of neutrality? How would you go, who would be the neutral party, the third party that take a decision on whether there is or not an infringement?
Just a quick reaction, that are excellent questions that will lead us to the second part of the meeting, which is to establish a roadmap on how to do this practically. And we are very open to all your suggestions, but I think that the lady there had a suggestion or a comment, sorry.
Hi, I'm Ellen Blackley with Disney. I just kind of related to that, I think it would be helpful to think about platforms as the different kinds of platforms. I think in the end, how it would be applied would probably be different for, you know, a cyber locker versus a social media platform, just off the top of my head. So I think it would be good to kind of start parsing that out. And I just want to say, I think the point David was trying to make about, or I don't know what point David was trying to make, he can speak for himself, but I think it is complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons I think it can't be just, I'm not sure in the, practically it's going to be that easy to always separate what's purely a law enforcement matter and what's not, and I think, you know, that will continue to be an issue to talk about as we go forward.
Okay. Yeah, David?
So I think what I was saying is that the terms of service and the operating procedures of many corporations are based on the letter of the law. They follow the law. And it would be nice if they took the position, as this young lady just said, that perhaps our terms of service and our corporate operating procedures are in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even if the law is written so that we can get around it, we won't, because we want to be good corporate citizens. That was sort of the message I was trying to make. And start at the highest level and then work down. Because if we start at the bottom, we're not going to get anything out of this group.
Alan, and then Sasha.
Hi, Alan Barth, the Ranking Digital Rights Project. I'm really eager to get to that second part of the meeting because we don't have that much time left. And I would just encourage us to add to that very concrete output that you're foreseeing about terms of service provisions, that we can use this platform also as a means here at the IGF in a more structured way and also clearly governed way to encourage discussions and to have this platform for discussions of different kinds of initiatives to promote how online platforms protect human rights of their users. So I hope that that will be a clear objective of this Dynamic Coalition as well.
So one last comment by Sasha, and then we will.
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring forward something we've done in the Netherlands about notice and takedown, where after some case law, intermediaries had to put down content that was either illegal or unlawful without any, if they were requested to, and if they saw the content and they felt that they had to do it. And so what we did as a sector was create guidelines that people could implement, that providers could implement to streamline this process, because sometimes it's very hard for people to see if a complaint is actually a valid one. We had complaints to take down books of which the copyright was already been passed for 100 years and etc. So it's good to have this kind of practices, because if this kind of instruments are in place, it saves a lot of time for platforms actually, because you will have structured ways to handle this types of information. So I think that will be very beneficial. Maybe not for like the big 5 platforms, but at least for a long tail. And I think we should also make an instrument that would be useful for the long tail, because the long tail today might be one of the big platforms in the future.
Exactly. I mean, that is a very good point, and one of the reasons of the development of this model contractor provision is also to facilitate maybe a startup that want to have a market, because that startup is protecting the user's human rights. So that is an excellent point. So coming back to the second part of our debate, we have to identify which are the key challenges, with the key rights that as Nicola was saying before, it is not possible to elaborate a complete set of provisions in a couple of months. It will take probably the time lapse from now to the next year to elaborate a couple of provisions that can have effective mechanism inside. And so I would like to open the floor to have suggestions on which are the 2, maybe 3 key provisions, key challenges that have to be faced at the very beginning of this project. Rebecca and Nick.
I just wonder if I could make an alternative suggestion, which you're welcome to reject as being completely out of hand. Just having observed some efforts to draft sort of ideal terms of service and so on, and just knowing how difficult that is. I wonder if, again, it depends on the interest of the group, but another approach might be to, I don't know if draft is the right word, but to make some recommendations on what company due diligence ought to look like on terms of service, make some recommendations on what stakeholder engagement around rights of users in private enforcement could potentially look like, or make some suggestions for some experiments or pilot efforts by particular platforms in carrying out due diligence or improving sort of the human rights grounding of their terms of service. Whether, that would be an alternative way to go, just depending on, I mean, if you have a group of people that are really primed to do drafting of terms of service, then please go ahead. But if there's also interest in, perhaps, maybe there's a group of people who want to draft ideal terms and conditions, and then there might be another group of people who might be more interested in perhaps suggesting some processes or some just engaging in some discussions with companies about what an engagement process on some of these issues might look like, or what a due diligence process might look like. That might be an alternative stream for those who are less expert at drafting terms of service.
I just wanted to respond to this. Yes, I think indeed those are the 2 alternatives. Here we go for very specific terms of service, maybe on one specific right or 2, or we go for a broader, over-the-top view, perhaps through some sector guidance, as it was suggested. But I want to mention we are just starting at CTS, the university where I'm currently working, a review of terms of service, which will enable us by the end of this calendar year to come out with what the best practices are with regard to a number, hopefully a high number of platforms. And so that's why we thought we could use this sort of empirical look to inform the process of drafting. And given that we have the dynamic coalition, we can maybe circulate the results, and then on the basis of that, see what people suggest and come out with even better practices, or a system of scoring. So that was the idea there. But of course, this shall be decided by the dynamic coalition. So it will be a collective effort to decide our roadmap. I think we will expand on this also through the mail list, which everyone is invited to sign up again, and it's contact@platformresponsibility.info. But given that we have another 10 minutes, any other suggestion? Nick, you had a point?
I was going to make a similar point to Rebecca. just personally, I spent 3 or 4 years of my life trying to come up with a set of substantive values that might be applicable. Coming up with substantive values is really hard, which is why we often turn to process instead of substance. And perhaps that might be a way to get better buy-in. We might be able to come up with a set of principles, but as the point was made before, if they're not practical, then they're of very limited significance. And I wonder if that instead might suggest, as a first initial step, focusing on some of the procedural issues about consultation, about transparency, those sorts of aspirational things that can actually add clarity. And looking at, if you are looking for a base set of substantive rights, then things like the unfair terms directives probably give you the closest set to a base set there that you can actually use. Things like the limits on absolute discretion for termination of a contract and things like that, which are really process-based rights rather than substantive rights.
Is that a human rights perspective? That's just a question.
Yeah, I think it is a human right. I think a human right in certainty of how the rules are applied to you. I think that there is a clear human right in living according to the rule of law.
I think it can be brought into human rights, yes, but the difference with the consumer protection, the unfair commercial directive, needs to be taken into account. Gabrielle.
Thank you. I mean, I agree that if you're going to do terms and conditions, I think one section would be on the appeals or redress mechanisms at some point. But I think on the substantive part, personally, I just think that it would be really hard to draft something. Even if you look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, I mean, it's fairly broad. I mean, there's like certain restrictions, but it's the case law that has said, okay, well, in those circumstances, that's, you know, that's lawful under international law or not. So personally, I think what I would see as being useful, even as a user, is having guidance on how the particular terms are applied. So maybe by referencing these criteria that I was mentioning earlier, but also having case studies, examples. So this is how we would approach it. We don't guarantee that this is going to be like this in your case, but just giving examples.
I think that one of the first steps regardless of the direction toward which we are moving, one of the first steps is to have a compilation of all these different kind of approach and projects that have already been put in place. I think, Mark.
I think it could be useful also to have meetings or to hear from lawyers that have worked in the past on terms and conditions, to hear the challenges that they were facing, because I'm sure that there was some kind of pressure in order to fit these into the boxes that we need to fit when we work for a company. But I've done this exercise before, not for Google, for another company. I can tell you that it's not easy, and so there are some specific challenges. Even when you talk about the Article 19, the Article 19 allows defamation, and God only knows what you can do with defamation online and offline. So there are specific challenges in drafting terms and conditions. So even before and beyond the due diligence or the check, I think it could be good to understand more in details what are the challenges that you face when you draft terms and conditions and you are a corporate lawyer.
Yes, Emma.
And I'd say particularly on how we've talked about both, the big five platforms or, the very large international companies who host a lot of content, and then also a real interest in providing guidance for the long tail. And I love both of those ideas. And I think those two kind of buckets of platforms will probably end up having very different implementation issues. And I'm sure for the massive platforms that receive, hundreds of thousands of requests a day and host millions and billions of pieces of content, scale and how you implement at scale is a huge driver in what they end up putting into their terms of service. So to be able to have those conversations and really draw that out with some of the big platforms and also with the small platforms and see from them, how do implementation questions affect what they're willing to put into terms of service, I think that would be hugely informative for this group as we talk about, what kinds of recommendations will actually be effective and useful to the platforms.
So, yes, please.
Another way to think about dividing up the work, in addition to the split Rebecca made about the process kind of issues and then drafting, I think even in the drafting you've got to get an understanding of the substance, and then this issue of how to present it to the customer are pretty separate, and I think that one should do the substance first and then worry about the way we present it to the customer. We've been around this horn on the privacy side for a long time, and it gets really confusing if you're trying to do both at the same time, since both are difficult to solve.
So maybe I missed what you were saying earlier, but if we want to remain engaged in this process going forward, how do we say, what's the mailing list, or how will we do it?
You can find information on platformresponsibility.info. If you want
Platform responsibility.
.info. And if you want to join the coalition, you have to send an email to contact@platformresponsibility.info. Thank you. Yeah, that's fine. In order to understand how do we proceed, if we go towards a set of recommendations, or if you start by analyzing a couple of provisions, I think to be democratic, either we try to do both, but it would be, according to me, quite ambitious to at least to do it together, unless we decide to do previously a set of recommendation and then some concrete solution that could be a third option. So to be democratic, I think it would be better maybe to ask to the audience, maybe raising hand, how many people here think that the best way could be to start with concrete, let's say 2 concrete provisions that could be inserted into terms of service. Could you, as opposed to starting with recommendations as proposed by Rebecca. Rebecca, could you please repeat your proposal on the recommendation to make it clear?
Yeah, I don't know if I was presenting it as a binary, we have to do one or the other. Maybe there's one group that's interested in drafting and another group that's interested in recommendations, and I doubt that everybody would want to be involved with either thing because of just different sets of expertise and different concerns and interests. And to get kind of maximum participation, if you just have drafting, what's going to happen is there's going to be a small group is going to go away and draft and then bring it back and just ask everybody yes or no, and give us some give us some track changes or something, and that's great. But if you want to be a dynamic that's not giving everybody an opportunity to participate with their different competencies and concerns. So it would be great to have a couple of different types of ways that people can contribute. But I may be an outlier in this view, so feel free to do something else.
In the forthcoming days, we can exploit the mailing list of the Dynamic Coalition to identify which individuals or which organization are keen on undertaking the development of the conditions, and who is keen on drafting the recommendations. Giancarlo.
Hello everybody, I'm Giancarlo Frosio from the Stanford Law School Center for Internet Society. My question is, but what is the exact scope of the recommendation? Because the point is that I think that right now there are a lot of projects around as rooms who are willing to come up with a set of policy recommendations related to intermediate reliability. So I'm trying to understand that, because my understanding of this project was that it was supposed to produce a set of model clauses. The recommendation is something definitely different that's going to overlap with other projects. So I mean, I'm trying to understand, first of all, what is the scope of this recommendation if you are going to move forward in that direction. And I'm trying to understand if it makes sense then to join forces with other projects and then use that set of recommendation that may be produced elsewhere to use as a basis for those for the model clauses. So first question is, what is the exact scope of those recommendations?
So I think this is something that would have to be hashed out on the mailing list. I think there were a number of ideas that were just aired. I perhaps came to this meeting with a wrong understanding. I didn't realize there was already a plan in place that people were going to just sort of implement. I thought that this meeting was to discuss what the Dynamic Coalition wanted to do. And generally, you don't hash out the scope in one meeting. But, you know, again, maybe I totally misunderstand the purpose. If it's really just meant to support your project and get multi-stakeholder approval on it, then that can be the purpose. But again, the reason I was very interested in this dynamic coalition is that there's a gap, that terms of service and private enforcement is not being handled well on a number of levels. One is the language, but another is on a whole set of practices around the language and the enforcement of the language. And I think there's a certain set of people in this room today who are very concerned with that set of issues. Now, I did not come with sort of a detailed work plan prepared to present to the group, because I thought we were going to discuss it and then find out who's in the room and then continue the conversation to decide what the scope is around practices. But if I'm mistaken, I'm happy to
No, but my
step
question
aside and
wasn't
shut up.
actually addressed to you, was addressed to the dynamic coalition, because now I see that there is this new option on the plate, and then I want to try to understand if the scope of this the scope of this policy recommendation is going to be different than what we have been discussed about having policy recommendation broadly dedicated to intermediate liability. So that's what I want to understand. I want to understand if it made sense to have a specific set of policy recommendations specifically related to this project. That's just what I wanted to understand with my question.
I just wanted to clarify. It's a fair point. Thanks for bringing that up. I only mentioned the project that we are starting as a possibility. We have the capacity, and it's still very much being shaped. So on the basis of what we decide here, it could be oriented towards one solution or another. So there was in no way a predetermined plan. The only final idea, the ultimate objective that we had was to have eventually some model contractual clauses, but that may well have to go through earlier sets of recommendation, engagement, talking to people and finding out what the challenges are before coming out with the actual model contractual clauses. We have time maybe for another 2 questions.
Yeah, very fast, not very short and concise, not questions but remarks, also because we are almost running out of time. Just for the sake of clarification, we have a mailing list. This is an inception meeting. We obviously cannot solve everything today. We have a mailing list exactly to discuss this, and I think that there will be some wrapping up with some clarifications after these remarks. But obviously, we cannot resolve every problem today with this meeting. Sasha.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that I do like the idea of having a set of recommendations and then using that recommendation to have like a model implementation of the recommendations in something that people can just use. That makes it very concrete, but it also gives the opportunity for people to implement their own versions of it if they want to. So I think that's definitely the thing we should try to do. And I would urge for really ending up in the end with a model contract as one of the or model terms of service as one of the outcomes, because like the drop-in stuff is really important, especially if that solves problems for like upcoming new players, etc.
Excellent. I think was there another comment? Ricky? No? No. Jeremy, you wanted to say something? No? Okay. So I think that just to wrap up a little bit, and then I will leave the floor to Nico to wrap up, definitely. To me, the best way to proceed would be to, first of all, create a sort of compilation of all the projects that have already been undertaken, because that is basic. Secondly, start developing a set of recommendations on the basis of which a set of model contractual provisions could be developed. To me, that is the most logical approach. I would like to know what the other members, or not members of the coalition, but attendees think about this. And Nico, if you have some final remarks.
No, I just want to say that this effort, I think it's particularly important, and it differentiates from others because it's a multi-stakeholder effort. So it would be particularly important to have, as Rebecca mentioned, more of the private sector, and more specifically even more platforms involved, so that we can have more recognition on the market. So I was pleased to see someone from Google. We have someone from Facebook that signed up as a member of the Dynamic Coalition, but was unable to attend. So in the future, if you come across platforms that might be interested, that would be very much welcome. And we hope to spread the word and have a broad membership. This would be the main advantage offered by the IGF to the debate on platform responsibility. So with this, I think...
Just to wrap up, maybe if we can decide by acclamation the plan that could be, I repeat, compilation of projects, recommendations, and elaboration of model contractual provision, discussing this on the mailing list. Who is in favor? Well, quite a few people are in favor. Okay. We are running out of time. Alan, do you have the final
Yeah, just one thing to clarify, because I'm not really sure. Before, you just said that what you want to do is to draft those recommendations and from that work on those model provisions. Mm-hmm. So that is not exactly what we discussed before, and where we would say we have these different ideas, and on the mailing list we will decide which of these people will want to volunteer for and want to be involved with. So I would suggest to open it up in that way, to leave that flexibility in there, before now at the very end of the meeting say, this is the plan, in this order, this one, what we're going to do, because I don't think that we might have the necessary support to work in that fashion.
That is an excellent suggestion. It is a perfect feasible alternative. So I think we can work also with this. I'm perfectly, in favor of both alternatives. Maybe this one allows more flexibility so I think this one could be better. Is everyone in favor with this?
I think we should keep it open. So maybe because of sometimes things work out of inertia, So someone proposes something, then we can have this proposal consulted and eventually decide upon it. So for now, this is the proposal. If we want to change, someone else has the burden to come up with some other proposal.
If I may just add a final suggestion. In my view, I think it would be best to avoid fragmentation of drafting of policy recommendation. So my view is that in order to be as authoritative as possible, we should be able to join up projects that now are on the plate on drafting policy recommendations. This is just my final suggestion, because now I see a new project for drafting policy recommendation which are dedicated to intermediate reliability. Another project we discussed the other day. There's another project on the plate. And I think that fragmentation should be avoided. This is my point of view, and we should try to be able to join up those projects in order to have a strong authoritative base.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, and thank you very much for all your extremely fruitful and interesting suggestions. Thanks a lot, and let's keep on discussing this with the mailing list. Thank you.